The March issue of Down East Magazine is out, and it is focused on Maine winter wellness, but it also goes in a lot of other different directions. Brian Kevin is the editor-in-chief of Down East, and he's with us again on 207. Thanks for coming in. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's take a look at some of what's in this month's issue, and we'll begin with the Maine Moment, which I always love. In this case, a photo from Little Lyford Camp, which is part of the Appalachian Mountain Club's trail in Maine.
Yeah, neat spot, and just gets at some of that winter magic that we like to try to get up front. Matt Trunger, who took this shot, he was working, I believe. He works for a little startup brewery you might have heard of called Allagash, and he was out there with a group, and he said, you know, I couldn't resist this angle. He evidently travels with both an old school 35mm film camera and a digital camera and shot it from both. He later sent me the 35mm version to compare and contrast, and it's a pretty unbeatable little romantic angle.
A lovely, tranquil scene.
You want to be there.
On to a great article featuring the photographs of Gabe Souza.
Yeah.
It's about offshore lobstering in Maine in the wintertime when the boats have to go as much as 45 miles off the coast to get the lobsters. So
the lobsters are heading for deeper waters this time of year, and historically there hasn't been a ton of folks in the lobster fleet in Maine who have pursued offshore fishing in the winter. But more and more folks, because of a few seasons worth of good landings, are springing for the larger and beefier boats that you need, both for doing the work out there, both that and for actually sleeping your crew, because if you're going to make these 45-mile trips, you're going to spend a few nights out there.
You're out there for a few days.
So it's a lot more of a commitment than the inshore fishery. And as you can see from Gabe's astounding photographs, you know, you don't see land. It's some pretty big water out there. You're dealing with tougher conditions, and so it's a real different experience. But that sort of sector of the lobster fishery is growing for a number of reasons. And as the climate changes in the Gulf of Maine, you know, many predict that one response that the lobsters might take is to move offshore, and it's possible that in another 20, 30, 50 years a lot more of lobstering in Maine might end up looking like offshore lobstering now.
And there aren't many people who are doing it, but the numbers may grow as the years go by because of those changes.
So Captain Richie Walker was kind enough to let Gabriel come along and on this boat called the Sea Glass. I've met these guys. They took me out for a promotional thing earlier this year. Great bunch of guys. They work real hard. The photographs that he brought back are just astounding.
Yeah, it's a compelling work of photojournalism. As we mentioned, this is the Maine winter wellness issue. There's an article on forest bathing. This is something I had never heard of, but as I read about it, I thought it sounded absolutely delightful. What is forest bathing?
It's almost an easy thing to kind of roll your eyes at and say like, an oddball wellness trend, but it's nature therapy is what it is. And the writer Genevieve Morgan spent some time with one of several. Maine has a handful certified forest therapists, folks who will take people out into the woods. You have the little bit of an experience of going with a Maine guide, a little bit of an experience of being with a clinical therapist, and sort of guide you through discussion and an element of meditation, and sort of working through a number of issues. This fellow here in these great shots by Michael D. Wilson, he works with folks, I think, recovering from cancer patients. He works with people that are in memory care.
That's what struck me, is the people who particularly benefit from this, and those two groups are the ones you mentioned, cancer patients, memory care, and for those people to get out, and this is not done at a fast pace. They might spend what, 2 or 3 hours and just go a mile.
Yeah, and it's not a hiking trip. Yeah, you're not like in it to cover ground.
You stop and you look and you listen and you smell and you really take in the experience and see the forest and experience the forest in a way that you wouldn't otherwise.
And I think anybody who's come out of less clinical sort of communion with nature and felt, you know, renewed and refreshed somehow can sort of understand where if you had somebody who had that kind of clinical training and could do that in a way that was a little more practiced, boy, there's a lot of value there.
All right, if you're looking for a different experience when it comes to Maine wellness, goat yoga. Smiling Hill Farm has been doing it for several years, and people just like it, and it's not hard to see why.
Yeah, and Smiling Hill, they're not the only folks to offer this particular service. It actually originated on the West Coast, but it seemed like such a Maine-y wellness trend that it bared some mentioning. So you go, you do yoga, you get out of the stuffiness of maybe your studio, you get into the open air, and then you have a chance to frolic with these tiny animals that, as the yogi who's profiled in this piece says, and you can see her doing her marvelous maneuvers there, it just gets you out of your own head a little bit. You know, it makes it so that you don't take this practice so seriously, that you come away with some more. These are just a handful of these different wellness trends that have like a bit of a Maine-y tinge we tried to package together.
I like it. The Maine Winter Wellness issue, the March edition of Down East Magazine. Brian, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we're going to return with 207 right after this.